The unintentional act of bonding. The cold metal walls of the alien ship surrounded Jack Carter like a cage. His wrists were bound, the rough shackles biting into his skin. The air smelled of iron, and something else, something wild. The aliens had captured him 2 days ago when his scout ship crash-landed on their planet. Since then, they had barely spoken to him, only feeding him strange, tasteless cubes and keeping him locked in a dimly lit chamber. Jack had heard rumors about the Drelvian Empire, a warrior race known for their strict traditions and deadly combat skills. Humans had little contact with them, and those who did rarely lived to tell the tale. Now he was their prisoner. The door to his cell hissed open. A massive alien, nearly 7 feet tall, stepped inside. His deep red eyes scanned Jack with curiosity. His armor gleamed under the dim light, and sharp black claws tapped against the metal cuffs in his hand. "You will come," the alien growled. Jack had no choice. The moment he hesitated, 2 more guards entered, gripping his arms and dragging him forward. They led him through winding corridors until they reached a vast hall, filled with Drelvian warriors. Their reptilian faces turned toward him, watching with unreadable expressions. At the center of the room, a figure knelt, a smaller Drelvian, wearing a thick iron collar around their neck. Their dark blue skin was marked with bruises. Jack frowned. A prisoner. The warriors surrounding them held weapons, but they weren't pointing them at the captive. Instead, their sharp eyes flicked between Jack and the kneeling alien. Something was wrong. The heavily armored Drelvian, taller than the rest, stepped forward. His golden markings signified his rank. A leader. "You are human," he said, voice heavy with authority. Jack nodded cautiously. "Yeah." And the leader pointed at the kneeling alien. "You will witness the execution." Jack stiffened. Execution? He barely knew what was happening, but something about the way the captive's shoulders trembled made his stomach twist. 2 guards stepped forward, their sharp-bladed spears raised. Jack acted without thinking. This wasn't right. "Wait," he shouted, straining against his captors. "You don't have to do this." Silence. The Drelvians turned to him, their red eyes flashing. The leader frowned, clearly irritated. "This is law. The traitor dies." Jack's eyes darted to the kneeling alien. He didn't know their crime, but he saw the way their hands clenched, how their breath came in short, panicked gasps. This wasn't a warrior prepared for death. This was someone terrified. And Jack had seen too many people beg for their lives before. He took a step forward, surprising even himself. His guards didn't stop him. His gaze locked onto the metal collar, a symbol of punishment, a sign of weakness. Jack reached out and gripped the collar. And then, in one swift motion, he pulled it off. A loud gasp filled the hall. The metal hit the ground with a heavy clang. Silence followed. Total, deafening silence. Jack blinked. His heart pounded. Then he noticed the expressions around him. The warriors weren't angry. They weren't even moving. They were staring, eyes wide, bodies stiff, hands gripping weapons so tightly that some claws dug into flesh. Jack swallowed. "Oh, what's wrong?" The kneeling aliens slowly lifted their head. Their golden eyes locked onto Jack's. Something unreadable. Asterisk, asterisk, awe, disbelief, and something deeper, asterisk, asterisk, flashed across their face. "You?" they whispered. Their voice shook. Jack took a step back. "What? What did I do?" The leader of the Drelvians stepped forward. His breath was unsteady. His hands clenched at his sides. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with shock. "You have claimed them." Jack felt his stomach drop. "I've what?" The leader's gaze darkened. "In our culture, to remove the collar of a bound warrior is to take them as your bondmate." Jack froze. His mind tried to process the words, but they slammed into him like a speeding truck. The kneeling alien wasn't a prisoner anymore. They belonged to him. Forever. The hall erupted into chaos. Some warriors fell to one knee in respect, while others hissed in anger. The leader raised a hand, silencing them all. He turned back to Jack, his expression unreadable. This was no accident. You are now bound. His eyes narrowed. Breaking this bond means death. Jack felt his breath hitch. What the hell had he just done? The unwanted bond and the rising conflict. Jack Carter stood frozen, his mind racing. The alien leader's words echoed in his head. You have claimed them. Claimed. Bondmate. What the hell does that even mean? Jack looked down at the alien he had just bonded with. They were still kneeling, staring at him with an unreadable expression. Their golden eyes gleamed with something: shock, confusion, maybe even fear. The room was still tense, warriors shifting uneasily. Some looked at Jack with deep respect, others with barely concealed anger. The leader stepped forward, his towering frame casting a shadow over Jack. You do not understand what you have done, human, he said, his voice low and heavy. To remove the collar is to claim responsibility. You have chosen them as your mate. You are bound by our laws. Jack's pulse pounded in his ears. Mate. Responsibility. What kind of alien nightmare was this? He forced a dry laugh. Yeah, no. That's not how it works where I come from. It was an accident. I didn't mean to. A sharp hiss came from one of the warriors. Another gripped the hilt of their blade. The leader's eyes narrowed. There are no accidents in our customs. The bond is sealed in the eyes of the Empire. If you refuse it— Jack watched as several warriors gripped their weapons. Ah. So rejecting the bond was a death sentence. Great. Fantastic. He was either stuck in an alien marriage or about to be executed on the spot. Jack sighed, rubbing his temple. All right. Let's say I go along with this. What happens now? The leader studied him for a long moment. Then he turned his gaze to the kneeling alien. Valerie, he said, addressing them directly. Rise. The newly freed alien, Valerie, slowly got to their feet. They were shorter than most of the other warriors, but their presence was no less commanding. The blue skin on their arms had dark markings, scars, or ceremonial tattoos. Their silver hair was braided tightly against their head. Jack expected them to be furious at him. Instead, they tilted their head, regarding him like a puzzle they couldn't quite solve. You are not what I expected, Valerie said finally. Their voice was calm, but had an edge, like a blade hidden beneath silk. Jack exhaled. Yeah, I could say the same about you. A tense silence followed. The leader turned back to the gathered warriors. It is done, he announced. The bond has been made. The human will be treated as an honored mate among us. Some warriors murmured in disagreement, but none dared challenge the leader openly. Jack barely had time to process this before two guards stepped forward, not as captors this time, but as escorts. You will come with us, one said. Jack had the strong urge to say no, to fight, to run. But where would he go? He was on an alien warship, surrounded by warriors who would kill him if he disrespected their customs. With no other choice, he followed. A new cage, a new role. Jack was led through a maze of hallways until they arrived at a large chamber. It was nothing like the cold, sterile prison cell he had been held in before. The room was grand. Dark metal walls, lined with strange glowing symbols that pulsed faintly. A fire pit sat in the center, surrounded by thick furs and strange artifacts. Valerie entered the room behind him, standing stiffly by the doorway. Jack turned to them. So, I guess we should talk. Valerie's golden eyes flickered to him. You are a strange creature, human. Yeah, I get that a lot. Jack ran a hand through his messy hair. Listen, I don't know your customs, and I sure as hell didn't mean to, bond with you or whatever. So, is there a way to undo this? Valerie's expression remained neutral. Breaking a bond is not impossible, but it is dangerous. Jack crossed his arms. Define dangerous. Valerie's lips pressed together. It would mean dishonor. Not only for me, but for you. In the eyes of my people, you would be seen as a betrayer. The dishonorable mate is exiled or executed. Jack's stomach dropped. So I'm stuck with you. A flicker of something unreadable crossed Valerie's face. For now. Jack sighed, sinking down onto a fur-covered bench. Great, just great. Valerie hesitated before sitting across from him. They studied him for a moment. You do not behave as a warrior. Yeah, because I'm not one, Jack muttered. Valerie frowned. Then why did you remove my collar? Jack met their gaze. Because I didn't want to see you die. For the first time, Valerie looked surprised. You risked yourself for a stranger. Jack shrugged. Call it a bad habit. Valerie said nothing for a long moment. Then, slowly, they nodded. Perhaps, they murmured, this bond will not be as simple as I thought. The rising conflict. The next few days were a blur. Jack was no longer a prisoner, but he wasn't exactly free either. He was watched constantly. Warriors whispered whenever he passed. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with anger. Word spread fast. The human had bonded with a Drelvian warrior. Not everyone was happy about it. Late one night, Jack sat in his chamber, staring at the fire pit, trying to make sense of everything. He needed a way out of this mess. A noise outside the chamber made him tense. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Jack barely had time to react before the door slid open. A shadowed figure entered. A blade glinted under the firelight. Someone was here to kill him. Jack barely had time to roll aside before the dagger sliced through the air where he had been sitting. He hit the ground hard, his pulse thundering. The attacker lunged again. Jack barely managed to dodge before grabbing a metal tray from the nearby table and using it as a makeshift shield. The figure hissed in frustration. You do not belong here, human. Jack's stomach twisted. They didn't want him here. And they were willing to kill him to prove it. The human who changed an empire. Jack barely had time to dodge the next strike. The dagger sliced through the air, narrowly missing his throat. His attacker moved like a shadow, fast and precise. Jack's instincts kicked in. He rolled backward, grabbing the nearest object, a heavy metal bowl from the table. Without thinking, he hurled it at the figure. Kilang! It smashed against their shoulder, throwing them off balance. Jack scrambled to his feet, breathing hard. Okay, he gasped, keeping his hands up defensively. Let's talk about this. The attacker lunged again. Jack barely managed to sidestep, grabbing their wrist in a desperate move. The alien was strong, far stronger than him. But Jack had something they didn't. Desperation. He twisted their arm just enough to knock the dagger loose. It clattered to the floor. The attacker snarled and threw a punch. Jack barely avoided it, but the force sent him stumbling into a chair. Before they could strike again, another voice cut through the chaos. Enough. The room froze. Valerie stood in the doorway, golden eyes burning. The attacker stiffened. Then, slowly, they stepped back, breathing heavily. Jack could see them better now. Another Drelvian warrior, smaller than most, but still built like a fighter. Their dark red eyes glared at him with open hatred. Valerie took a step forward, their expression unreadable. Why are you here, Rasik? Rasik hesitated, then spat on the ground. This human is a disgrace. You dishonor yourself by standing at his side. Jack exhaled. Well, nice to meet you too. Valerie didn't react. They simply tilted their head. You sought to kill them. Rasik straightened, to end the mistake before it spreads. Jack frowned. Okay, yeah, definitely not a fan of that plan. Valerie's gaze hardened. You would challenge my bond. A flicker of hesitation crossed Rasik's face. It was a dangerous thing to question a warrior's bond. Even Jack, a clueless outsider, could see that. But Rasik's rage burned too deep. He is not one of us, Rasik growled. He does not fight. He does not follow our ways. Valerie stepped closer. And yet, he stands. He faced your blade and still breathes. That is more than many can say. Jack blinked. Was that a compliment? Rasik scowled. Then, after a long moment, they turned and stormed out of the chamber. Silence settled between them. The fire in the pit crackled softly. Jack let out a long breath. Well, that was fun. Villari turned to him, their expression unreadable. You should have called for help. Jack snorted. Yeah, because I totally had time for that while getting stabbed. For a moment, he thought they might argue. Instead, Villari just studied him. You are difficult. Jack chuckled. Yeah, I get that a lot. A lesson in strength. The next morning, Jack woke up sore and exhausted. His arm was bruised where Rasik had slammed him into the chair, and his ribs still ached from the scuffle. But when the door to his chamber slid open, he wasn't expecting what came next. Villari stood there, arms crossed. Come, they said simply. Jack frowned. Come where? Villari's gaze didn't waver. If you are to remain bonded, you must understand our ways. Jack sat up. And that means. Villari turned, already walking away. Training. Jack groaned. Fantastic. The warrior's trial. The training hall was a massive open space, filled with stone pillars, sparring rings, and weapons that looked way too deadly for Jack's liking. Dozens of warriors were already there, watching him as he entered. Some murmured in disapproval. Others simply stared. Jack sighed. This was going to suck. Villari led him to an open sparring ring. We will start simple. Defend yourself. Jack blinked. Against who? Villari's fist hit his chest before he could react. He staggered back, wheezing. Ow. What the hell? Villari didn't look sorry. Your reflexes are slow. Jack coughed. No kidding. He barely had time to recover before Villari moved again. This time, Jack managed to dodge, just barely. Villari nodded. Better. Jack scowled. Oh, I am so gonna regret this. A human among warriors. The training continued for days. Jack learned quickly that the Drelvians respected strength above all else. He wasn't as strong as them, but he was fast, creative, and stubborn as hell. At first, the warriors mocked him. By the end of the week, they watched him with interest. He wasn't winning fights, but he was surviving them. Villari didn't say much, but Jack could tell they were impressed. Perhaps, Villari said one night, after another brutal training session, "You are not as weak as I thought." Jack smirked, wiping sweat from his brow. Gee, thanks. That almost sounded like a compliment. Villari tilted their head. Perhaps it was. For the first time, Jack felt something strange. Not fear, not frustration, but acceptance. Like maybe, just maybe, he was starting to belong. The shadows of rebellion. But just as Jack was settling into his new role, things took a darker turn. One evening, as he walked through the corridors, he overheard whispers. The human is dangerous. Villari is blinded by the bond. He must be removed. Jack's blood ran cold. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. Now, he was in the middle of something far bigger than himself, and someone wanted him dead. The betrayal and the choice. Jack pressed himself against the cold metal wall, his breath shallow. The voices continued, hushed but full of venom. The human weakens us. Villari is blinded. The bond should never have happened. He must be removed. Jack's pulse pounded in his ears. He had spent weeks trying to earn the respect of these warriors. He had blood in their training rings, taken their insults without backing down, even survived an assassination attempt. And still, they wanted him dead. His fingers curled into fists. He needed to get out of there, fast. Carefully, he stepped back from the corridor, moving as silently as possible. But before he could retreat, a voice came from behind him. You should not be here, human. Jack spun around, his heart slamming against his ribs. It was Rasik. The Drelvian warrior stood in the shadows, arms crossed, eyes burning with resentment. His stance was relaxed, but Jack knew better now. This was a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Jack forced a smirk. What? No dagger this time. Rasic tilted his head. If I wanted you dead, you would be dead. Great, Jack muttered. That's real comforting. Rasic took a step closer. I heard what you did today. You fought well against Tovak. You lasted longer than most would have. Jack frowned. And let me guess, that still doesn't mean I belong here. Rasic was silent for a moment. Then, surprisingly, he said, No, it does not. Jack exhaled. Right. Of course. But Rasic continued, You are not as weak as I believed. Jack blinked. That almost sounded like respect. Almost. Before Jack could say anything, Rasic's expression darkened. You must listen carefully, human. There are those who do not just dislike you. They see you as a threat. Jack's chest tightened. Yeah, I figured that out when someone tried to stab me in my own quarters. Rasic ignored his sarcasm. This is bigger than you. Velary's bond to you has upset the balance. There are those who see it as a sign of weakness. Jack frowned. So they want to kill me to prove a point. Rasic's jaw tightened. They do not want to kill just you. They want to challenge Velary. Jack stiffened. Velary. If someone challenged them for control, they would have to fight. And if they lost, they would be executed. Jack swallowed hard. This wasn't just about him anymore. Rasic's voice lowered. If you care about Velary, you will leave. Disappear. End the bond before it gets worse. Jack stared at him. You really think I can just walk out of here? Rasic narrowed his eyes. I can help you escape. Jack's stomach twisted. This was it, a way out. But leaving meant abandoning Velary. Could he really do that? The price of loyalty. Jack sat alone in his quarters, staring at the fire pit. Rasic's words echoed in his mind. End the bond before it gets worse. They will challenge Velary. He rubbed his hands over his face. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't a leader. He was just a guy who had made a really bad mistake by taking off a collar he didn't understand. But Velary. He thought about their golden eyes, the way they had stood by him when no one else did. Velary had protected him, trained him, even defended him in front of the others. And now, because of him, they were in danger. Jack exhaled slowly. He had to make a choice. The challenge begins. The next morning, the air inside the training hall was thick with tension. Warriors gathered in a wide circle, watching in complete silence. Jack pushed his way through the crowd, his heart pounding. He already knew what was happening. A challenge had been declared, and Velary was at the center of it. Across from them stood a towering warrior, Tovak, one of the most feared Drelvians in the Empire. His armor gleamed under the dim light, his claws already stained from previous battles. Jack's gut twisted. This wasn't just a fight. This was an execution. Velary stood tall, but Jack could see the tension in their shoulders. They weren't afraid, but they knew what was at stake. Tovak smirked. You have grown soft, Velary. A warrior bound to a human is no warrior at all. Jack clenched his fists. Bastard. Velary's expression remained calm. Then prove your strength. The hall fell into silence. Then, Tovak attacked. The fight for honor. The clash of metal rang through the hall. Velary moved fast, dodging Tovak's massive strikes. But Tovak was relentless. Each blow meant to break, not just defeat. Jack could barely breathe as he watched. The fight was brutal. Velary landed quick, precise strikes, but Tovak's strength was overwhelming. Then, Tovak caught Velary's arm. Jack's breath hitched. Tovak twisted, throwing them hard against the ground. Velary didn't move. Jack's chest tightened. No. No. No, no. Tovak raised his blade for the final strike. Jack moved before he could think. He threw himself into the ring. The gasps around the hall were deafening. Tovak froze, his blade hovering just above Valeri's throat. His eyes narrowed. "You break our laws, human." Jack didn't care. He stood his ground. "If you want to kill them," Jack said, his voice steady, "you'll have to go through me first." Tovak snarled. "You think you can challenge me?" Jack's heart pounded. He wasn't stupid. He knew he couldn't win this fight. But he didn't have to. He just had to change the rules. He took a deep breath. "I invoke the right of Bondmate's claim." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even Valeri's eyes widened. Tovak stiffened. "You do not even know what that means." Jack smirked. "Yeah. Well, humor me." The Drelvian leader stepped forward, eyes piercing. "A bondmate's claim allows a bonded warrior to challenge an opponent on behalf of their mate." Jack's stomach dropped. Oh crap. That meant he had to fight. Valeri finally pushed themselves up, breathing hard. "Jack, no. You will die." Jack grinned despite himself. "Yeah, well, I'd rather die on my feet than watch you fall." For the first time, something shifted in Valeri's gaze. Something Jack couldn't quite name. Tovak growled, "Then you die first, human." Jack took his stance. And the fight began. The breaking point. And the true enemy. The training hall fell into complete silence. Jack stood in the ring, fists clenched, staring at Tovak, a warrior twice his size, with claws sharper than knives and a reputation for leaving his opponents in pieces. Jack had no weapons, no armor, no chance. And yet, he stood his ground. Valeri, still wounded from the fight, tried to rise. "Jack, this is madness. Step back." Jack exhaled, never taking his eyes off Tovak. "Sorry, can't do that." Tovak let out a deep, growling chuckle. "You think you can survive against me, human?" Jack flexed his fingers. "I don't need to win. I just need to keep you busy." Tovak's eyes narrowed. "Fool." Then he moved. Jack barely had time to react before a blur of muscle and armor crashed toward him. He dodged, barely. Tovak's fist grazed Jack's ribs, sending a sharp pain through his body. If that punch had connected fully, he would have been crushed. Jack gritted his teeth. "Think. Use your speed. He's stronger, but you're faster." Tovak lunged again, claws flashing. Jack ducked, rolled, and snatched up a broken weapon handle from the ground. A makeshift staff. Not much, but better than nothing. Tovak snarled in irritation. He hadn't expected Jack to last this long. Jack adjusted his grip. "What's wrong?" "Not used to someone fighting back." Tovak roared and charged again. This time, Jack struck, swinging the staff low, aiming for his knee. Cray kick. Tovak stumbled, surprised. Jack didn't hesitate. He swung again, harder this time. The staff smashed into the warrior's side. The crowd gasped. Jack had just landed a clean hit. Tovak snarled, but there was a flicker of respect in his eyes now. Jack's lungs burned, sweat dripping down his face. He wasn't winning, but he was surviving. And in the Drelvian culture, that meant something. A hidden betrayal. Jack knew he wouldn't last much longer. Tovak was too strong. He had to think of something. Fast. Then movement in the crowd caught his attention. A shadow slipping through the warriors, moving toward Valeri. Jack's breath caught. It wasn't just a challenge. It was a distraction. Someone was using the fight to get to Valeri. Jack's mind raced. If he lost focus now, Tovak would finish him. But if he ignored the assassin, Valeri would die. His heart pounded. No choice. Jack threw his weapon aside. The crowd gasped. Tovak looked at him in confusion. "You surrender." Jack didn't answer. He turned and ran toward Valeri. The assassin was fast. Jack was faster. At the last second, he slammed into the attacker, knocking them off balance. The blade meant for Valeri sliced Jack's shoulder instead. Pain exploded through him. But he didn't stop. He tackled the assassin, grappling for control. The figure thrashed, hissing in frustration. Jack caught a glimpse of their face. Rasik. It was him. Jack's vision blurred from pain, but he pushed forward. He wrestled the dagger from Rasik's grip and drove an elbow into his gut. Rasik fell back, gasping. The warriors around them finally moved, grabbing Rasik, restraining him. Tovak, watching from the ring, scowled. You abandoned the fight for them." Jack clutched his bleeding shoulder. "Yeah, I did." Tovak studied him for a long moment. Then he let out a slow breath. "You are a fool," he said finally. Then, to Jack's surprise, he stepped back. He was yielding. The leader of the warriors stepped forward. "You invoke Bondmate's claim, and yet you do not fight for yourself. Why?" Jack exhaled. "Because I don't need to prove I'm strong. I just need to prove I won't let them die." Silence filled the room. Then, a deep, guttural sound. Tovak was laughing. "Perhaps you are not as weak as I thought, human," he admitted. "Perhaps you have earned your place." Jack blinked. "Wait, what?" The leader nodded. "The challenge is resolved. The bond stands." Jack exhaled, his legs shaking from exhaustion. He had done it. He had saved Villari. And somehow, he had earned the respect of the warriors. The truth revealed. Rasik was dragged forward, still struggling. Villari, breathing hard, wiped blood from their lip and stared him down. "You betrayed us," Villari said. Rasik sneered. "I did what needed to be done. The human weakens us. He is a stain on our honor." Jack scoffed. "Yeah, and trying to stab your own people in the back. That's honorable." Rasik's expression darkened. "You think this is over, human. There are others who believe as I do. You cannot stop what is coming." Villari stepped forward. "Enough. You have disgraced yourself." The leader of the warriors turned to Rasik. "You will be exiled. Your name erased from our records. You are no longer one of us." Rasik's eyes widened. No, you can't." The warriors dragged him away. Jack finally let himself breathe. It was over. For now. A new future. That night, Jack sat beside Villari, watching the flames flicker in the fire pit. "You risked your life for me," Villari murmured. Jack gave a tired smile. "Yeah, well, you would have done the same." Villari tilted their head. "You are unlike any human I have known." Jack smirked. "Yeah, you're unlike any alien I've met." Villari's golden eyes softened. "Perhaps our bond is not so terrible after all." Jack looked at them, feeling a strange warmth in his chest. For the first time since arriving in this place, he didn't feel like an outsider anymore. War or peace, the ultimate decision. Jack sat in the dim glow of the fire pit, the heat warming his sore muscles. His shoulder still ached from where Rasik's blade had sliced him, but the pain was manageable. What wasn't manageable was the storm brewing outside these walls. Villari sat beside him, silent. Their golden eyes reflected the firelight, unreadable as always. "You don't believe it's over, do you?" Jack finally asked. Villari exhaled, their fingers tracing the edge of their blade absent-mindedly. "No." Rasik was only one voice in the darkness. "There are more." Jack ran a hand through his hair. "Great. So I've got an entire army of angry lizard men who think I don't belong." Villari's lips twitched. "You exaggerate." Jack snorted. "Do I?" Villari's gaze grew serious. "The Drelvian Empire values strength, but more than that, we value stability. A bond like ours, it has no precedent. Some will see it as a sign of change. Others will see it as a threat." Jack sighed. "So what do we do?" Villari looked at him, something firm settling in their expression. "We prepare. A kingdom divided." The next morning, Jack found himself in the council chamber, a grand hall with towering metal pillars and intricate glowing scripts carved into the walls. He stood alongside Villari, facing the Drelvian High Council. 7 figures, each representing a different faction within the Empire. Some were old and wise, others young and ambitious, but all had one thing in common. They were watching Jack like he was an unpredictable bomb about to explode. The High Warden, a battle-scarred warrior with blackened horns and piercing silver eyes, leaned forward. "Your presence here, human, has caused disruption." Jack shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, I noticed." A second council member, a woman with deep blue skin and golden tattoos, studied him. "The challenge was settled, but unease remains. Many believe you are a weakness." Jack crossed his arms. "And what do you believe?" The room was silent for a moment. Then the High Warden spoke again. "That depends. Do you plan to stay?" Jack hesitated. He could feel Villari watching him. If he left, he could be free. No more fights, no more challenges. He could go back to Earth, if they even let him. But if he left, what would happen to Villari? To everything they had fought for? Jack took a deep breath and lifted his chin. "Yeah, I'm staying." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Some council members nodded in approval. Others frowned deeply. The High Warden leaned back in his seat. "Then you must prove yourself. The Empire cannot be divided. You will either unite it or destroy it." Jack swallowed. No pressure, right? The assassins in the shadows. Later that night, Jack and Villari walked through the halls of the fortress. Jack sighed. "I have a feeling that wasn't a friendly meeting." Villari glanced at him. "The council is split. Some believe in tradition. Others are willing to adapt." Jack groaned. "Let me guess. The ones who don't want to adapt are gonna try and kill me." Villari was silent, which meant yes. Jack rubbed his temples. "Man, I really should have stayed in my cell." Suddenly, a noise in the distance. Villari stiffened. Jack turned. The hallway behind them was empty. Too empty. "Something's wrong," Villari murmured. Jack barely had time to react before the lights flickered, and the attack began. Figures emerged from the shadows, moving with deadly precision. Jack's body reacted on instinct. He ducked as a blade slashed where his head had been seconds ago. He lashed out, kicking one attacker in the knee. They staggered but didn't go down. Villari was already moving, their blade cutting through the air in fluid, practiced motions. 2 assassins fell in seconds. Jack, however, was struggling. His body still ached from the fight with Tovak, and these enemies were faster than anything he had faced before. One of them got past his defenses. A blade sliced toward his throat. And then, Villari was there. They blocked the strike with their own body. Jack's breath caught. Vellor. Villari gritted their teeth, blood trickling from a wound on their shoulder. But they kept fighting. Jack felt something burn inside him. He was tired of running. Tired of being the weak one. With a growl, he grabbed the nearest attacker's arm and twisted hard. A sickening crack filled the air as their wrist snapped. Another came at him, but Jack ducked low and drove his fist into their gut. He wasn't as strong as the Drelvians, but he was learning. The last assassin hesitated, realizing the fight wasn't going as planned. They turned, trying to escape. Villari threw their blade. It struck true. The attacker fell. Silence. Jack breathed heavily, heart pounding. Around them, the bodies of the assassins lay still. Villari pressed a hand against their bleeding shoulder. "You are improving." Jack chuckled breathlessly. "Yeah. Well, I'd rather not have to prove it so often." But inside, something was changing. For the first time, Jack felt it. He belonged here. The decision that would shape the future. The next morning, Jack and Villari stood before the council again. The High Warden's expression was unreadable. "You were attacked last night." Jack nodded. "Yeah, and we stopped them." The golden-tattooed council member leaned forward. The assassins were not just rebels. They were trained. This was planned. Jack clenched his fists. Someone in this room sent them. The air grew heavy. Valerie stepped forward. This proves what I have said all along. The Empire must evolve. If we continue down the same path, we will fall to our own divisions. The High Warden studied them. Then, slowly, he nodded. Perhaps you are right. Another member scoffed. You expect us to trust a human. Jack met their gaze. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to stop trying to kill me for 5 minutes. Silence. Then, laughter. It wasn't all of them, but it was some of them. The High Warden rose. Then let us decide. Will the human remain in this empire as an equal, or will we reject the bond that has already been made? The vote was cast. Jack held his breath. Finally, the High Warden turned to him. It is decided. Jack's heart pounded. You stay. A mix of approval and outrage rippled through the room. But it was done. Jack turned to Valerie. Valerie gave him a rare, small smile. It seems we are stuck with each other. Jack smirked. Yeah, guess so. And for the first time, he didn't mind at all. The bond beyond blood. The decision had been made. Jack Carter was no longer just a human outsider. He was now recognized as part of the Drelvian Empire. But the war was not over. If anything, it was just beginning. The shadow that remains. Jack had expected things to get easier after the Council's decision. He was wrong. Tensions ran high. Some warriors accepted him, but others still watched him with thinly veiled hostility. Some believed he had earned his place. Others believed he was a mistake. And then there were the ones who stayed silent. Those were the ones Jack worried about the most. The assassination attempt. It happened 2 nights later. Jack had been walking the halls with Valerie, discussing strategies on how to unite the fractured warriors. Then, out of nowhere, an explosion rocked the fortress. The walls trembled. Fire erupted from one of the lower chambers. The sound of warriors shouting filled the air. Jack's instincts kicked in. That wasn't an accident. Valerie's expression hardened. No. They both took off running. Smoke filled the corridors as they reached the war hall. The damage was severe. The council chamber had been hit directly. Jack's stomach twisted. This wasn't just an attack. This was a coup. Inside the chamber, the High Warden lay bleeding on the ground. Several other council members were dead or wounded. The room was filled with smoke and debris, but Jack could still see figures moving in the shadows. They were still here. And then, from behind the chaos, a familiar voice. You should have left when you had the chance, human. Jack turned sharply. His blood ran cold. Rasik. Jack had thought he was exiled, but he had returned, and he wasn't alone. Behind him stood an entire faction of warriors, armed and ready for war. You really don't know when to quit, do you? Jack muttered. Rasik smirked. Neither do you. The battle for the Empire. The fight erupted instantly. Rasik's faction charged forward, their weapons clashing against the warriors who remained loyal to the council. Jack had no time to think. He barely dodged the first attack, twisting away as a blade slashed inches from his throat. Valerie was already moving, their sword flashing as they cut down an enemy warrior. Jack grabbed the first weapon he could, a fallen warrior's double-edged dagger. He wasn't an expert, but he had learned enough to hold his own. The room became a war zone. Jack fought with everything he had, dodging, striking, moving. He took a hit to the ribs, pain exploding through him, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not when everything was on the line. Not when the future of the Empire was at stake. And then, Jack saw Rasik making his way toward Valerie. No. Jack forced his way through the chaos, shoving past fighting warriors. He saw Rasik raise his blade, aimed straight for Valerie's back. Jack didn't think. He threw himself between them. Steel met flesh. Pain erupted through Jack's body as the dagger buried itself in his side. Valeri turned, too late. Their golden eyes widened. Jack. Jack gritted his teeth. "I'm fine." He was not fine. Rasik snarled, ripping the blade free, but before he could strike again, Valeri struck. Their blades sliced through Rasik's armor, piercing his chest. Rasik gasped, his eyes widening in shock. He stumbled back, clutching the wound. Valeri didn't hesitate. With a final, brutal strike, they ended it. Rasik fell. Dead. The battle was over. The moment of truth. Jack collapsed to his knees. The wound in his side was bad, blood soaking through his clothes. Valeri was at his side in an instant, their hands pressed against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "You idiot," they murmured. Jack gave them a weak smirk. "Yeah, but I saved your life, so you're stuck with me." Valeri shook their head, but there was something soft in their eyes. "You are more than just a bondmate now, Jack Carter," they murmured. "You are one of us." Jack's vision blurred. He could hear the warriors around them, some murmuring in shock, others stepping forward to kneel. The Empire had seen it. Jack had fought. Jack had bled. And now, Jack was Drelvian. The dawn of a new era. Jack's recovery took weeks. But when he finally stood before the newly rebuilt council chamber, he realized something. He wasn't a prisoner anymore. He wasn't a mistake. He wasn't just Valeri's bondmate. He was part of something bigger. The Drelvian Empire had changed. And Jack Carter, the human who should have never survived, had helped shape its future. As he stood beside Valeri, watching the warriors bow in respect, he smiled. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't such a bad place to call home after all.